There will be 3 stages to today's experiment. The first one will be gathering together your materials and helping your students to prepare. The next step will be carrying out the experiment itself. And the third step will be discussing the outcome and the variations you can make to the experiment. So, for our first step, we're going to gather together our materials and help our students to prepare. The materials you'll need for this experiment are quite simple. You'll need a large jar with a wide opening at the top that you can get your hand down through. This you're going to fill almost to the top with cold, fresh water. You're going to need a small jar that will fit easily inside the big jar. You're going to be filling this jar with warm, kind of hot water, but not too hot. You're going to need some food colouring to add to this little jar, and you're going to need a tray to carry out your experiment in, just in case of any messes. You're also going to need the worksheet. Now, you can give one to each student, or you can give them one per group. The next step to this experiment will be asking your students some questions to decide how much knowledge they have before they carry it out. Our first question will be, what is an experiment? What is a hypothesis? An experiment is when a scientist carries out a test to try and find the answer to a question. And a hypothesis is where a scientist tries to predict the answer or the outcome to their experiment before they carry it out. The next question we're going to ask our students are there different types of water on the planet? Well, there are numerous types of water on the planet, and you'll get lots of answers from your students. But today, we're going to concentrate on hot and cold, and salt water and fresh water. And our final question for getting our students ready is, do they think these types of water are the same, or have they different densities? Now, density is a term that refers to how closely packed the molecules in the liquid are. A liquid that has closely packed molecules is a very dense liquid, and one where the molecules are more spread out is more loosely or less dense. You might like to refer to density when you're carrying out this experiment with your students. However, you may also like to use the terms lighter and heavier, particularly if you're working with a younger class. Okay, so once you have gathered together all your materials and you've asked the students their questions, the next thing you can do is you can carry out your experiment. Now, the first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to add some food colouring to your little jar of hot water. I've already added some here, but I'm going to add just a little bit more. I'm going to get my straw and I'm going to put it down in my food colouring, and then I'm just going to transfer a bit across. And you can keep doing this until you're happy with the colour. You'll need the colour of the water in the little jar to be quite dark so that you can really see the effect when you put it into the big jar of cold water. The other thing is you don't need to use red food colouring, you could use green or blue. Once you're happy with the colour of the water in the little jar, you can lower it down into your big jar of cold water. Now remember, when you do this, you need to make sure that the little jar is nice and steady on the bottom before you let go and take your hand out. Once you have your little jar placed inside the big jar, we're going to watch to see what happens. And we can see that the warm water from the little jar starts coming out and rising up through the cold water in the big jar until it reaches the surface. Now, once you've carried out your experiment with your students, you can discuss with them what is happening and why. Okay, so for the final step, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss the outcome of our experiment with our students. So our first question is, what happened? Well, as we saw from our experiment, our hot water rose up to the top of our jar when we placed the small jar in. But why did this happen? The answer to this question lies in the fact that temperature affects the density of liquids. As water is heated up, the molecules in it spread outwards, making it less dense, which meant that when we put the small jar of hot water into our big jar of cold water, the less dense hot water rose up to the top of the jar, where it sat on the cold, denser water beneath it. The next question is, how does this affect the water in our oceans? Well, in our oceans there are areas where water is heated up and cooled down. Take, for example, the Gulf of Mexico, where the Gulf Stream starts. Water is heated up in the Gulf of Mexico, where it rises and begins its journey northwards past Ireland until it reaches the Arctic Ocean. Once at the Arctic Ocean, it cools down and it sinks, and then starts its journey back to the Gulf of Mexico again, where the cycle can continue and repeat itself. Finally, we're going to look at a variation of this experiment, where we use salt water and fresh water. This will help your students understand density even more. So for this experiment, you're going to need some of the items we used earlier, plus a few new things. You're still going to need the big jar with the wide opening. You're going to need your small jar that you're going to put down through. You're going to need food colouring. Your students can still use the worksheet that they used earlier, as there's a section to fill in with this experiment on it. You're going to need cold tap water and some salt. The first thing you can do with this experiment is make up some salty water. We've put about 200 millilitres of cold tap water into this cup. And to that, we're going to add about 3 teaspoons of salt. Now, I've got 2 added already, so I'm just going to add the last one. Perfect. And we're going to give it a stir. Once you have your salty water made up, you can fill your little jar with your salty water. And then add some of your dark food colouring to it until you've got a small jar of coloured salty water. Once you have this ready, you can carry out your experiment. You're going to lower your small jar into the big jar just as you did in your earlier experiment and see what happens. I think that's nearly in the middle. Hold on, I'm just gonna. Now. So, we've lowered our little jar down into our large jar of fresh water. And as you can see, there's lots of exciting things happening. The salty water that's in the little jar is just sitting on the bottom and nothing is happening, because the salty water that's in the little jar is denser than the clear fresh water that's surrounding it. When we put our little jar of salty water all the way down to the bottom, because it's surrounded by less dense fresh water, it hasn't even come out of the bottle. Of course, you can ask your students why they think this is happening before you explain the reasons for it to them. Okay, so now that you have your experiment done with your students, you might like to discuss some points with them. What happened in this experiment and why? In this experiment, when we put the small jar of salty water, which was coloured, into the large jar of fresh water, nothing happened. The coloured salty water just stayed in the jar. Why did the students think this might have happened? And why didn't it come out of the jar, like it did in the last experiment, when we used hot and cold water? In this experiment, we put the denser water into our little jar. Salty water is denser than fresh water. And when we put the denser salty water into our little jar and lowered it to the bottom of our big jar, it didn't come out because the water that was surrounding it was less dense fresh water. You could try this experiment by putting the denser salty water in the big jar and putting some coloured fresh water in your little jar and trying it the other way around to see if you get different results. Now, another question I like to ask students is, does this happen anywhere in nature? Does fresh water ever meet salt water so that they might mix together or stay separate? Where a river flows into the sea, fresh water flows in on top of salt water. And when the conditions are right, this can form a layer of fresh water on top of a layer of salty water. If you can imagine that you went fishing at an estuary where a river met the sea, you might put your fishing rod in, and if it stayed at the top, near the fresh water, you might catch a freshwater fish. If the line from your fishing rod had a weight on it, and it went down to the bottom, it might go into the saltwater layer, and you might catch a saltwater fish. Another question I like to ask the students is, does this always stay separate, or do the two types of water ever mix together? Now, while you can find layers of freshwater and saltwater in the ocean where they are separate, in general, freshwater when it enters the ocean does mix together with salty water. It's caused often by the tides or the waves mixing together along the coastline or around estuaries. If you'd like to take this experiment further or find out more information about freshwater and saltwater, you can see our lesson plan, Water Salinity, Temperature and Ocean Currents, which can be found on our website, explorers.ie.